camp meetings to conference camps and the predecessor conferences to Upper New York. Camp meetings started as outdoor revival meetings on the American frontier during the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century. People came from a wide area to camp, pray, sing hymns, and listen to itinerant preachers at the tabernacle. Camp meetings in the early years sprang up in a variety of places, often at the instigation of a church or group of churches where a maple grove or an acreage near a river or lake might be made available. This illustration shows a typical early camp meeting similar to those in New York State. In early days in Upper New York, I've got a few examples of those, some with this slide, some later. Dr. George Peck wrote about an 1813 camp meeting at Minden in Montgomery County. Those having charge of the preparations would select a spot in the dense woods and proceed to clear away the bushes and small trees, piling the brush around the encampment and forming with it an impassable fence, sometimes 10 or 12 feet high. Within this enclosure, the tents, perhaps 100 in number, would be pitched. The conventional pattern provided for the preacher's stand to be located at a central point. Around the stand, a space was left to accommodate the auditors, for whom benches were provided as far as possible. Immediately in front of the speaker's stand was an altar rail or its equivalent, to which penitents were invited to come in response to exhortations. At a little distance from all of this, and forming a quadrangle around it, were the temporary homes of the attending people. These dwelling places were normally cloth tents, though in later years, simple wooden structures were erected. Here the campers came annually, bringing the bare necessities for subsistence for the duration of the camp, such as bedding, provisions, and cooking utensils. At Palmyra, now in Finger Lakes District, Wayne County, Palmyra's weekly newspaper edition of June 28, 1820, noted out-of-town visitor James Kelser died June 26, the day after he drunkenly left the campground, following the evening services of a camp meeting, which was held in this vicinity. The Palmyra Register's next edition denied that its editor intended to charge the Methodists with selling alcohol at their campground, while they professedly met for the worship of their God. Worship included singing. The pictured camp meeting psalm pages come from an 1859 publication of the Golden Harp with spiritual songs, selected by G.W. Henry. There was also, of course, preaching and praise. At the Methodist camp meeting, the more gifted itinerant preachers, a bishop, a traveling elder, or an itinerant evangelist of notable reputation, would give the sermon. Lorenzo Dow was the most famous Methodist camp meeting preacher of the early days. Dow was unconventional and never ordained. Reverend Francis Ward wrote about a September 1806 meeting in Petersburg in the Troy Conference. By Sunday, there were more than 60 tents in a circle formation, plus many covered wagons and other lodging places, and there was a congregation of several thousand people. The hours for preaching, announced by sound of trumpet, were at 10, 2, and 7 o'clock, and at midnight. Family prayers at sunrise in the tents were followed by a general prayer meeting at 8 a.m. Intermissions were filled with prayer, exhortation, and praise throughout the day and night. It was said that the hours of the day were as one uninterrupted assertion of superlative devotion. In Appalachian, then in the Owego district near Bennington, a 3-day Grove meeting in fall 1874, along with weeks of revival meetings, led to the formation of a Methodist society here. In Corning in Steuben County, in the mid-1850s, the ME Church of Corning resolved to join with Lawrenceville to hold a camp meeting. The bottom stereoscope slide shows the tabernacle tent at Round Lake in Adirondack District. As the camp meeting movement became more firmly established and people a bit more affluent and comfort-minded, many associations were formed to purchase appropriate sites for the permanent establishment of camp meetings. In times, these were generally equipped with a covered tabernacle and dining hall. Other buildings followed. Individuals and churches often built cottages to replace the tents of the early meetings. Some families spent vacation periods in these cottages when the camp meetings were not in session. Now we come to established camp meeting sites. First, we'll do Northern New York Conference. In this conference, Pleasant Point in Crossroads District, now Oswego County. The first Oswego District camp meeting was in 1874 at a Pleasant Point Grove near Lake Ontario with several tents put up. A committee was established to find a better place for the next year. This better place found is Denser Grove in New Haven. Camp meetings started in 1875 here with over 100 tents and 3,500 attendees the first Sunday. There were 2 gates, one for horses and buggies and another for buses from the trains. The campground was named Denser Grove for John Dempster, a well-known Methodist minister who was a member of Black River Conference. Black River Conference later in 1873, Northern New York Conference came from it. In 1876, cottages were erected. In 1908, the Ladies Improvement Society was organized to keep the buildings, etc. Large religious, temperance, and missionary meetings were held here. Trenton Assembly Park in Bonneville is now a Mohawk District, Oneida County. This Northern New York site was incorporated under various names. And I'm not going to read all the dates, but Rome District Campground, Trenton Camp Meeting and Christian Workers Conference in Barnevall, New York, Trenton Assembly Park Association of the Mohawk District of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and Trenton Falls Camp Meeting Association of the Utica and Herkimer Districts. In the early 1900s, joint meetings were held for the Rome and Herkimer districts. A 1902 policy closed the gates on the Sabbath. In 1908, the vexing Sunday question was solved by securing slightly additional facilities for the religious care of the crowds and by arranging for their control by providing the regulating musical influence of the Fort Dayton Band of Herkimer, New York. When the larger Camp Aldersgate opened in 1948, Institute programs were shifted there. Trenton Assembly Park incorporated in April 1986. Wellesley Island was a Northern Flow District, Jefferson County. Well, still is, I guess. Thousand Island Park at the head of the island was founded in 1875 by a Methodist pastor as a summer camp colony. By 1890, at this pay-for-admission resort and meeting ground, entered from the water via the pavilion, there were nearly 600 cottages and 7,000 summer inhabitants. A large fire in 1912 ended the grand times, though the park continued to operate. An association formed by Methodist men of Troy, New York, purchased land by Round Lake in 1868. This is in Saratoga County, and held its first camp meeting in September with about 8,000 people and over 50 pastors. Later, it became the setting for a youth institute and is now an incorporated village with an historic designated site of Victorian village cottages, etc. Riverside in Paris was an Adirondack district, Warren County. While a young adult attendee in 1980 listed this as a campground, Riverside was turned over to the young people to Epworth League and for many years was used for youth institutes and similar conferences. Some laity planned their summer vacation time to coincide with the institute so that they could share in the fellowship and serve as adult leaders. As many as 240 young people were housed in dormitories and cottages on the Riverside grounds. The emphasis was on classes dealing with Bible study, missions, social problems, evangelism, and worship. Riverside continued to have Sunday services sponsored by cottage owners who populate the grounds each summer. Now we switch to Wyoming Conference, the part in New York State. Carmel Grove, in Bennington District, Broome County. The Grove was a campground from 1872. The ground was cleared, fence built, a preacher's stand put up, a spring of water bought, a temporary boarding hall erected, auditorium furnished with seats. The first sale of lots occurred September 17th, with about 100 sold. In 1896, a covered auditorium was erected in the Grove, and gates and tickets were introduced. In 1899, since Carmel was not doing so well as the districts nearby Dimmock Grove in Pennsylvania, Carmel switched from the plain gospel approach to the Chautauqua plan. The first Epworth League Summer Camp Institute started in the summer of 1912, but in June 1914, a cyclone destroyed the auditorium and Carmel Grove ceased to serve as a campground. The Epworth leaders went to Casanova, where the Central New York Conference held their institute in the seminary buildings. However, Carmel Grove wasn't done quite yet. In 1915, a news report, orphans in Deaconess home caused disruption. Pre-deaconess and a housekeeper resigned. Neighbors complained and threatened legal action because of noisy boys and girls. The solution was a temporary relocation of the children and a caring deaconess who all moved to Carmel Grove. The Grove was a remote Methodist summer campground in an area now in the heart of Benwell, New York. In 1915, it was so desolate, it was called the City in the Woods. Hooper Road was still a rough dirt road, making access difficult. Cabins lined wooden walkways, and a huge hotel dominated the peak of the hill. The only way to reach the campground was by horse and buggy, after at that time a lengthy train ride from Bennington. It was felt that this location would prove safe for the children in a setting where they could be less of a bother to other children. The deaconess in charge of the noisy brood at Carmel Grove requested in October that a new location be secured quickly because the children were in danger of contracting colds in the unheated cabins, and the weather was getting chilly. A nearby camp meeting was a Owego District campground in Spencer and Tioga County. Camp meetings were held in Spencer from August 1865 until a major fire just before the August 1881 camp meeting. Cindy Grove Campground is now in Oneonta District in Delaware County. After holding meetings from the 1840s on, the Shenango and Otsego districts of Wyoming Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church decided in 1873 to secure a permanent camp meeting site. The Cindy Grove Camp Meeting Association was chartered in 1874, and later starting in 1919, Epworth League Summer Institutes, youth and young adults, were also held here. The properties of Cindy Grove were transferred to the Epworth League Institute Commission in late 1925 and dissolved in late 1949. Other groups were welcomed on the grounds, and groups vacationed together in the cabins. There were also dormitories. My paternal grandparents purchased the City Center Cottage, and the grandma's diaries talked about going to stay there sometimes. Central New York Conference was involved with summer schools and institutes and later conference camps, so it's going to be illustrated later. Wesley Park, Niagara Falls, Niagara County. In 1884, the Niagara Falls International Camp Meeting Association opened Wesley Park with a temperance gathering, a missionary conference, and a meeting of the Holiness Association and the International Camp Meeting. 50 acres of this 200-acre park consisted of forest. The land was laid out in circles, crescents, and streets. 914 buildings were built on 50 feet wide by 100 feet deep lots. Within the large circle called Epworth, there assisted an auditorium to be used for Methodist camp missions, missionary and temperance convention. However, the falls drowned out the preachers. The lots were sold off by lottery in 1887. In 1893, the site of the Wesley Park Camp Auditorium was acquired by the Niagara Falls Collegiate Institute. Now this is the Epworth Circle neighborhood. In 1860, the Chautauqua region and part of the southern tier, with Corning and Bath, were shifted to central New York in exchange for Pennsylvania territory. Fairpoint on Lake Chautauqua, now in Cornerstone District. Fairpoint had been a camp meeting ground before it was taken over by the Chautauqua Institution. Chautauqua Institution itself was started August 1874 on the western shore of Chautauqua Lake by inventor Lewis Miller and Methodist preacher John Haya Vincent as a summer teaching camp for Sunday school teachers. Silver Lake is now in Genesee Valley District, Wyoming Conference. A Methodist-affiliated camp facility was established in 1873 on the east side of Silver Lake, which was a Methodist revivalist summer camp in the 1870s and 1880s, but evolved to a cultural, educational, and religious summer institute in the Chautauqua tradition during the 1880s and 1890s, and finally to a secular summer cottage community in the early 20th century. In the 20th century, the 1900s, the summer camp meeting faded. Summer institutes and other programming were added to the meetings. Camps for children and youth were developed. Some of the sites previously mentioned and other sites had institutes later on, as noted here in 1923. So Round Lake is one. I just have to find the numbers. Riverside Riparius, Sydney Grove, Barnes Alpha Assembly Park, Trenton, Casanova Seminary, Cook Academy, Montour Falls, Silver Lake Assembly, Syracuse University, Fulton Institute Herkimer, Silver Bay, Chautauqua, Lake Titus up in the Adirondacks, and Dexter Grove here all had the Epworth League Institutes and other summer schools. Before the conference camps that were part of Upper New York Conference, there were earlier conference camps of the merging conferences with their predecessors. These earlier Methodist-affiliated camps include Dexter Grove Campground, listed earlier, which is now a family non-denominational Christian camp, Dexter Grove Christian Campground. Wells Island, later called Watson Homestead and Painted Post in Steuben County, in August 1955, Thomas J. Watson Sr., founder of IBM Corporation, and his wife transferred the land to the Genesee Conference of the Methodist Church, along with nearly $1 million for buildings. In 2006, Watson Homestead Conference and Retreat Center became independent of the Methodist Church. In 2022, it became part of the YMCA and is now the Y at Watson Woods. In 2010, when Upper New York Conference was formed, it had 6, now 5, camp and retreat centers spread throughout New York State, which came from the merging conferences with their predecessors. Aldersgate, Red was here, Asbury here, Casawaska here, Finley here, Sky Farm here, and Sky Lake here. That's in order of their founding. And now more on them. Aldersgate was in Mohawk District, Lewis County. The King Farm property at Branningtonham, New York, on a small Adirondacks lake with a cement block farmhouse, was purchased in 1946 for Camp Aldersgate by the Board of Education of the Northern New York Conference, and the first camp buildings erected by 1948. 1958, 59, the 1880 former Brantington Four Corners Methodist Protestant Church was moved here as a chapel. Asbury. As noted earlier, the 1873 Silver Lake Institute evolved over the decades. 13 acres were designated a National Historic District in 1985. In 1944, the Silver Lake Institute trustees purchased the adjacent Sutton Estate and changed the name to the Methodist Manor, where summer programs were held. In the late 1940s, money was raised to remodel and refurbish buildings used for summer programs. In the late 1940s, 3 additional summer cabins and a building, snack shack, to house the book room and soda fountain were built. In 1957, this and additional acreage were deeded to the Genesee Annual Conference for Camp Asbury and was further developed. In 2007, a new Asbury Manor was completed to replace the Methodist Manor. Casawaska, Figure Lakes District. This is the former summer estate of the Theodore Case family on Oswaska Wasco Lake, which was purchased 1946 by the Central New York Annual Conference at a big discount to the asking price, provided the site carry on the case name and the land be used in ministering to youth and children. It is now Castle Wasco Camp and Retreat Center, and that was Case plus Wasco made Castle Wasco. And of course, the children and youth are here, as seen in the other picture. Finley, now private. Methodist historian Dwayne H. Christen wrote, the United Brethren purchased a 100-acre farm on the shores of Lake Finley, at the far western edge of New York State, which they intended as a permanent location for a summer Bible and training school, although the first had been the summer of 1915 at Sugar Grove in the old seminary building. The Erie Conference United Brethren also conducted annual conference at Camp Finley between 1941 and 1971. Finley Camp and Retreat Center was part of the Upper New York Conference of the United Methodist Church through 2015, after which its use was studied. The Camp Finley property was transferred to new ownership as of March 2018 to continue its Christian ministry in Western New York and Western Pennsylvania as a non-denominational camp at Finley. Sky Farm, Adirondack District, Warren County. The land for Sky Farm on what is now called Sherman Lake near Warrensburg was given to Troy Conference by Dr. and Mrs. Luther Brown for the Christian education of young people, provided that his younger comrades would see the project through. The camp layout was designed and built, and by 1955, the camping program was burgeoning. Programs and buildings grew. Sky Lake in Bennington District, Broome County. 1947, Sky Lake near Windsor, New York, was purchased by Wyoming Conference to take the place of the defunct Sydney Grove Camp Meeting Grounds. Over the next few years, 10 additional acres were purchased. The Sky Lake property was dedicated and a mortgage burned in 1950. A winterized facility was built later. And these are some of the resources that I used for the presentation. Faith in Action, A History of Methodism, the Empire State, 1784 to 1984. A Flame of Fire, The Story of Troy Annual Conference by the Swartzes. He holds the stars in his hands. Centennial History of the Wyoming Annual Conference of the Methodist Church, put out in 1952. Historical Highlights of the Northern New York Conference, 1873 to 1985. History of the Western New York Conference, 1999. The periodical Methodist History in April 1980 had a 14-page The Camp Meeting on the Frontier in the Methodist Religious Resort in the East before 1900. Reminiscing Methodists of Central New York, 1968, and various online and printed resources.